So Christopher Columbus is where the apush test starts. Keep in mind, obviously, there were a lot of people here before Columbus, but apparently the AP test prefers to stick with the Italian-born navigator who found fame when he landed somewhere in this continent hemisphere area on October 17th, 1492. Columbus sailed the ocean blue. He set sail representing Spain, and he had three ships: the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Ignore the typo. Originally, he sailed west across the Atlantic Ocean, hoping to find a water route to Asia. He was looking to open trade passages. He was convinced that he had found this waterway when he landed, probably in Jamaica, but who knows. And he therefore named the people he saw here Indians in honor of the people of India, which is where he thought he was. He returned from his expedition with gold, and it encouraged future explorations. Amerigo Vespucci, right? He is the Portuguese explorer who discovered South America and for whom the Americas get their name. His discovery suggested that the expedition had found this new world, and that's where we get the idea of a new world. In 1497, he wrote an account of his journeys here and what he saw, and therefore they name it America after him. The Treaty of Tordesillas, that's my Spanish, just go with it, was an agreement between Spain and Portugal in 1493, and it's what created this papal line of demarcation. In other words, it's basically what divided the New World and said that anything east of the line was going to belong to Portugal and anything west of the line was going to belong to Spain, and it was to try to prevent the two from having any future wars. Portugal also received a lot of what is today Brazil, and that's why Brazil speaks Portuguese. And then later it is going to impact colonization in Africa and Asia as well. New Spain, Spain's tightly controlled empire in the New World. This was mostly in North and Central America, including the Caribbean, Spanish East Indies, and then parts of like Florida, St. Augustine, that area. In order to deal with labor shortages, the Spaniards developed a system of large manors, which have that funny Spanish encomiadas, right? This is like a plantation, a Spanish plantation, that used Native American slaves that belonged to the conquistadors, which is Spanish for conquerors. With the death of Native American slaves, Spaniards began importing African slaves to supply their ever-growing need of labor. Mercantilism, fancy name for trade, right? It was the primary way that the colonies are going to make money. It was the prevailing economic philosophy of the 1600s that said that colonies existed to serve the mother country. So an English colony, their whole point was to raise money for England. It was founded on the belief that the world's wealth was sharply limited, and therefore one nation's gain was another nation's loss. There wasn't the idea of unlimited wealth in the world. It was this balancing act. Each nation's goal was to export more than it imported in a favorable balance of trade. The difference would be made up for in their possession of gold and silver, and then this would make the nation strong both economically and militarily. Those who followed this theory believed economic activity should be regulated by the government. So it was very much so the idea that the colonial governments all need to serve the mother country governments as well. Queen Elizabeth I, Protestant successor to the crown in England, took over after her half-sister, Queen Mary. She was very, very popular. She was the first woman to successfully hold the throne. Yes, Queen Mary had been there, but she wasn't very well liked, and she didn't really do that much. Queen Elizabeth is going to conquer a lot of lands. The movie Elizabeth is about Elizabeth. She spent a lot of money on England fighting the Spanish, whether it be their armada, which is their navy, or it be on land in the New World. She also is going to establish Protestantism in England and encourage English businesses. And she's going to live from 1533 to 1603. That might have been when she ruled. It doesn't really matter because that's English. Just know that she's the one who really gets interested in England coming over here. In 1588, the Spanish Armada was defeated. The Spanish Armada was the navy, and it was thought to be the biggest and best navy in the world. England proved this wrong. It was assembled by King Philip II of Spain to invade England, but the British are going to have military leaders like Francis Drake, who are going to know the English Channel better, and they are going to be the ones at the Battle of Gravelines to fight against the Armada and defeat them. England's victory over Spanish forces was one of the greatest achievements of Queen Elizabeth I, as it established England as an emerging sea power. It also helped the Spanish Empire to decline, which means that eventually the English Empire is going to become the most prominent in the world. This actually says three types of colonies that existed in the world, ignoring that part of it got chopped off somehow. So there's three different types of colonies. Uh, you have a charter colony, a royal colony, and a proprietary colony. In a charter colony, basically, if you want to form a charter colony, the colonists, if you want to think of them as being like little businesses, right? They're members of a corporation, and then they're going to elect people from the colonists themselves. They get to have say over their government, but everything like the laws and the charter, which is just a set of laws, are all agreed upon between the colonists as well as the mother country. Royal colony, the governor who is in charge of it is picked for by England. So England flat out picks the king, picks out the governor. The governor served in the leadership role and chose additional lower ranking officers, but really they were just puppets of the British crown in this case. And the proprietary colonies were owned by individuals with direct responsibility to the king. Each proprietor selected a governor who served as the authority figure for the colony. English Puritanism. Basically, in England, Henry VIII wanted a divorce. He wasn't allowed a divorce because the Pope didn't allow it, so he gets rid of Catholicism in England and instead puts in its place Anglicanism, which is basically Catholic minus the Pope. However, there were a lot of people in England who really liked what Martin Luther, the guy who was like, oh, I don't like you, Pope, here's 95 reasons why, let me nail it to the church. They really liked what he was saying. And so there was this whole movement of people within England who wished to reform the Church of England to be more in line with this Puritan, this more pure philosophy. So though King Henry VIII had set out to separate his own church and all that stuff, the Puritans rejected some of the stuff that the Catholics did as well. Basically, they liked the idea of the Anglican, but they thought it was impure. They wanted to purify it and get more in tune with the actual like Puritan beliefs and stuff like that. Calvinists are a type of Puritan, if you will. And they believe things like predestination. So you are born into certain roles that you have to fulfill, and that the Bible was more important than the Pope himself. When they moved over here, this is going to be the Pilgrims, if you will, but not really because they're the Puritans and the Pilgrims are different, but just go with it. When they come over here, they are going to instill the Puritan work ethic, which is going to be self-reliant, so rely on yourself, not on others, have high moral convictions, and then also be as smart as you possibly can. A joint stock company is a type of business structure that was used by some colonial explorers to raise money for their expeditions. The most famous joint stock company was the East India Stock Company, but there were many other smaller ones. These private trading companies sold shares to investors who provided startup funding in return for taking on the risk of the investment. So it was some people paid for the profits of the expedition. It's kind of like buying somebody's plane ticket before they travel because you think they're going to go over there and find a treasure. The Dutch West India Company, not to be confused with the Dutch East India Company, but whatever. This one was the one that was based predominantly in what would today become New York. That's why old New York was once New Amsterdam. Hey, that's that. It carried on a profitable fur trade with the Native American Iroquois in the area. And it also relied heavily on the patron system, in which large estates were given to wealthy men who could bring at least 50 families over to the New York area. Not very many people took an opportunity of this because it was hard to get 50 families, but that was how they were seeking to try to control who moved to the region. And if you could afford to come, then that would mean that you would have some wealth. So it was one way to try to make sure that the area stayed relatively wealthy as well. Sir Walter Raleigh is going to settle Roanoke Island in 1587, and the goal was to create the first English settlement in the New World. He returned to England to secure additional supplies, but when he returned, it was gone. It magically disappeared. And to this day, nobody really knows for sure what happened to the Roanoke settlers, but the people were all gone. Most of the land had been like ravaged and looked like no one ever belonged there. It basically just disappeared. It was probably aliens if we're being serious. Raleigh abandoned his attempts to colonize Virginia after the failure at Roanoke, and he was held back by a lack of financial resources and the war with Spain. And so, therefore, it's going to be another 15 years before the English are able to successfully start their first colony in the area. The Spanish and the French are going to be more successful. In St. Augustine, Florida, in 1598, the French Protestants, which are known as Huguenots, came to the New World because they wanted to freely practice their religion. France was a Catholic country, and they were persecuting the Huguenots. So they're going to come over, and they're going to create a colony in what is modern-day Florida. Spain, which oversaw Florida, reacted violently to the Huguenots as well, mainly because A, they thought that the French were trespassing, which they were, and B, the Spanish were also Catholics. So the Spanish are going to send a force to the settlement, and they're going to massacre the fort's inhabitants, and then it's still considered to be the first permanent European settlement in what would become the U.S., even though the French were not going to be very successful. Finally, the English are going to make it. They're going to come here in Jamestown in 1607. It was named for James I, which was Queen Elizabeth's successor in England. He granted charters for charter colonies, so he gave basically businesses the right to come over here. In 1607, the Virginia Company of London settled the site that claims it was the first permanent English settlement. Excuse me. It was very, very swampy, and because of this, there was a lot of disease. Contaminated water is going to poison most of the population. And also there were a lot of Native Americans there in the area, and they were pretty hostile. They weren't like open-armed with these new people. But John Smith was the leader. He was charismatic. He was able to keep this colony from collapsing despite all these struggles. In 1619, African slaves are going to arrive here, and they became the first group of slaves to reach the British settlement.